quick follow-up video to my Pregnenolone 101 video. We'll call this Pregnenolone 102 in the spirit of being fully informative and humble. I'm not an expert in this topic, right? I've done a lot of research. It's my goal to deliver accurate information that I have done accurate research on. Anything that I present that's in the realm of fitness or exercise science and things like that, I would consider myself an expert on. But when we get into things like, this is something that has to do with the endocrine system, and I know quite a bit about pharmacology, but I'm not an expert, and I'm willing to admit what I don't know. So in the spirit of being fully transparent, I like to kind of record my videos first. If I get a good take, I'm not going to go back and do the whole thing over because it's quite long. So I usually watch back a few times and critique myself of where I could have been more accurate or delivered better. And in the spirit of just delivering that accurate information, I'm just going to go over a couple minor corrections as well as some additional information that I just meant to expand upon in the previous video. This is kind of in the order that it was presented in the video, so we'll go from there. So just a minor correction, when I was listing the hormonal cascades, testosterone does break down into estrogen, but there are three different forms of estrogen, right? So there's actually estrone, which is known as E1, estradiol, which is E2, and estriol, which is E3. Estradiol is kind of the one that everybody really knows about when we talk about estrogen in most cases, especially in regards to men. Women are a little more complicated, but we're really referencing estradiol. So technically testosterone directly breaks down into estradiol, and then estradiol in the body, in females obviously, males too, but again only really clinically implicated in females, breaks down into estrone and estriol. Also, the word neuro technically means nervous system, but your brain is the, especially when we're talking about pregnenolone and brain concentrations, right, is kind of the central operator of that nervous system. So just a minor correction there so everybody has the vocabulary right. Couple things I did want to expand on that I think are pertinent here. So pregnenolone is mostly produced in the adrenals, actually. This is something that I just actually went back and learned today, learned something myself. So it is found in high concentrations in the brain, as I stated in the first video, but it actually is primarily produced in the adrenal glands, and I meant to expand in the last video on how the adrenals are, I'm assuming very likely, it's safe to say, why it gets so depleted in people with chronic life stress and trauma. So stress and trauma is obviously very hard on the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands basically are going to help regulate your stress hormone cortisol and whatnot, especially in women where they don't have testes. Remember, the gonads in men produce pregnenolone as well, along with other androgens in high concentrations in men. And women don't have that kind of a buffer system, right? So when women go through stress and trauma, their adrenals just work overtime, whereas men can sometimes be a little bit more resilient physiologically to that. So good to know that it is mostly produced in the adrenals, although found in high concentrations and acts heavily upon the brain. Another interesting tidbit that, again, we didn't really dive too much into the mechanism of the negative allosteric modulator, but just kind of interesting and important to note here for people that found the point about THC and pregnenolone interesting. So pregnenolone actually, by the way of that negative allosteric modulator, it forms a negative feedback loop with the CB1 receptor. And what that does is it actually prevents THC from fully activating that receptor, and that's how it modulates it. So some people even report when they take high enough doses of pregnenolone, they actually can't feel THC the way that they used to. I'm trying to think, for me, it might be less strong. But that's a good thing because it was kind of activating me too much. Again, I'm on a lower dose of pregnenolone, but very interesting nonetheless mechanistically how that works. And as far as schizophrenia, we mentioned just briefly the mechanism in schizophrenia. I was referring to that CB1, given that I was kind of drawing an inference that marijuana is heavily implicated in schizophrenia. But it could just as well, I've seen research on both, so it could be CB1, could also be, it's not concluded yet, could just as well be the GABA, GABA glutamate systems as well. They're pretty much involved in everything. So mechanistically, it's not entirely clear what's going on with pregnenolone and schizophrenia. CB1 is a good candidate given that what we know THC can do negatively to schizophrenia, but again, could just as likely, and I've seen research speculating on GABA A and NMDA receptors. DHEA, so just a minor clarifying point. I did mention it was a neurosteroid, but I said a lot of people consider it a hormone. So this is technically a neurosteroid, but what I meant by that is that DHEA, and again, a different video, I am going to do, I think, a video on breaking down blood work, blood panels, what to test for, how to interpret. I think that'd be very helpful for people, but just for the sake, again, of being precise in this video, DHEA is a neurosteroid, but in many ways, I'm not going to divulge what they are here, but it actually can act like a hormone. And pregnenolone can too, but a lot of people find DHEA to be very, very powerful and mimicking some very prominent effects of like androgenic hormones. So just because DHEA is a little further down the stream, so just important to mention. Also, in the sake of doing right by the gentleman that inspired the information in this video, that brought the information for this video, Dave Lee, I did clarify he does only specialize and treat men. So it's men's hormone replacement therapy. And I just think it's important to clarify. I don't want to misrepresent his work and what he's an expert in. I'm sure he knows quite a bit about women too. I wanted to expand a little more on low pregnenolone symptoms in the next point. So big one is actually memory. And this is why in older folks it can be so valuable to supplement. Cognitive, kind of hand in hand with the cognitive functions, right? Memory is big. If there's memory problems, especially when we're dealing with something like TBI or stress and trauma in the past, there's memory problems. Pregnenolone is, again, it's another thing that kind of points you to maybe there's something to look at here. And then in some I've read, this isn't as clear in literature, but I've read accounts of people that claim that it helped their sexual function. Pregnenolone itself doesn't have any androgenic activity, so it doesn't actually like directly act on testosterone and the androgens, but again, downstream it does influence things, so it's very plausible that that could obviously be something. And everybody knows that it's often stated, kind of old verbiage, is that the biggest, the most important sexual system in the body is the brain. And obviously there's a bunch of cognitive benefits to pregnenolone and high concentrations in the brain, so it would make sense. Pregnenolone, this is really important. I meant to touch on this last video, and I say so many things to talk about the ADHD component that I don't realize. I'm not going to go back and re-record it. So pregnenolone, the first step, so pregnenolone kind of branches off and converts in one of two ways, either to a different metabolite of pregnenolone, which goes down the stream kind of into like allopregnanolone and things like that. Again, different conversation, but important for the sake of this video is that the other pathway that it converts directly into, and often heavily so, and this is obviously I'm gonna point out for women here, this is big, is progesterone. Okay, so again, we're not going to go into the specific benefits of progesterone for the sake of this video, but in women, this is a big player in a multitude of symptoms, especially for women who are like in hormone therapy for, could be PMDD, right? Could be menopause, but at any rate, there are women who supplement or take progesterone, and I just think it's important that these women are also testing that base level neurosteroid that converts directly in, because again, if I just give you progesterone, you might have somewhat of a response, hopefully not a negative response, right, as a woman, but you might not be getting the full response if that pregnenolone needs to be backfilled. And you may be able to avoid the progesterone altogether if you backfill the pregnenolone. So it's very important to kind of start with the base and then work our way out. That direct conversion into progesterone is key. Reason for intolerance to stimulants. So wanted to just touch on this because I didn't in the last video when I was talking about those symptoms. So I've not seen any mechanism suggested for this. This is just an anecdote that proved to be true from Dave Lee. It proved to be true for me after Dave Lee said it. I would imagine it's the GABA A receptor, right? Stimulants are going to be very, very excitatory and activating, and the GABA A receptor needs to be properly working mechanistically in order to kind of curb those side effects from the overactivation of the nervous system. And then THC, obviously, it's the CB1, and like we discussed a few minutes ago, you know, if that CB1 receptor is out of whack from lack of pregnenolone, then the THC could be overactivating the receptor. And again, I theorize that's what's going on in schizophrenia. Because these individuals clearly would seem to have like a very sensitive endocannabinoid system, and maybe that's why pregnenolone has some neuroprotective properties there. But nonetheless, just important to mention directly that given its modulation of the CB1 and the GABA receptor, could be the NMDA receptor, glutamate too. I'd have to really dig into the literature on that as far as, you know, stimulants and whatnot, but it's very plausible. I wanted to make a point here, just a couple more things. So you're going to see psychiatrists with 3 question marks. I could do a whole other video, and it's a very touchy topic. And eventually I probably will, on kind of psychiatry and where we're at. You know, I don't want to step on any toes here. I understand that psychiatry for mental health can be life-saving for some, and at one time in my life that was me as well. But also many people are harmed greatly by psychiatry. And psychiatry, and you know, again, if a clinician is seeing this or whatever, sorry to step on toes, but it's a pseudoscience, and it's fueled directly by a lot of dirty money from pharmaceutical companies. And that's not to say that there aren't benefits. Again, I'm not taking away that lives can be saved from psychiatry. There's good in it too. But it's guesswork. I mean, they're operating on a book full of symptoms. The DSM there's no biological evidence. It's a bunch of symptoms that we put labels on. They're playing roulette essentially with their eyes closed of let's just try this med, this med, these very powerful psychotropic drugs. And so that kind of brings me to, I don't want to go off on a rant on a tangent on psychiatry in this video, but it does kind of bring me to like, you know, I'm over here doing my own homework on, they tell me I have ADHD. Okay, again, what is that? We're not so sure. It's real, symptomatic, it's certainly real, I can tell you firsthand. But, you know, they give me the stimulant medication, and then I tell them I have these side effects, and then they don't really have a good answer for that, and then I'm kind of left in the dark. And I do all this research and find out, like, oh, I have low pregnenolone, and that's why I'm not tolerating stimulants. I fix the pregnenolone, suddenly I can take my meds, my whole life gets better. And, you know, it's kind of just a side note for me is like, why isn't psychiatry, given that all they do is prescribe based on symptoms, like, before we hand out pills to people based on symptoms, shouldn't we be doing blood work? Shouldn't we be like testing these things, endocrine function, neurosteroids, where we're able to? Shouldn't there be a competency, again, in a field that you see someone for 10 to 15 minutes, you get an arbitrary label, and then you know, you play roulette with a very powerful drug? I just think it's a little bit irresponsible on the part of the healthcare system. And I'm not blaming individual, you know, this is the game, and they got to make their living too and whatever. Most clinicians are very well, and you know, they're well-meaning. But it is curious to me because this is not hard to order a blood test. Like, I've never known a psychiatrist to like test someone's thyroid. You know, thyroid and low hormones can cause all of the same symptoms as everything in the DSM can. So very interesting kind of as a side note here, and something that I probably will expand upon at some point in my video series. Last point, I wanted to just expand a little more, again, I meant to in the last video, when assessing blood levels of pregnenolone. Okay, so I mentioned that the half-life of pregnenolone is less than an hour. It is like 40 to 45 minutes. I think it can be up to like 3 hours, 3.5 hours, but most commonly I've heard it's about 40 to 45 minutes. What you can do, so you can test, I tested just the regular, I didn't really know about what I'm about to tell you when I was testing originally. I was just testing pregnenolone, the regular version, and again, I don't really have a doctor helping me, I'm ordering these myself. But what I actually did find out, again, credit to Dave Lee, is that you could test the sulfonated version, so pregnenolone sulfate. And that actually has a 7 to 22 hour half-life. So pregnenolone sulfate is a metabolite of pregnenolone in the body. And you can test that, again, very little known test, clinicians, it would seem. And you can establish, a little more of a accurate reading. Now, like I said, I got to my low pregnenolone kind of diagnosis through just testing the 45 minute half-life first thing in the morning a few times of the regular pregnenolone in the body. And that was accurate for me. But if you want to be precise and you want to kind of bypass that very short half-life, where that can obviously, it can be a sketchy marker, although if you have it consistently, like I said in the last video, it's a pretty good indicator. But at any rate, the sulfonated version will have a much longer half-life and give you a little bit more of an accurate reading. And then just assessing, like, if you find out you're low in pregnenolone and you supplement. So again, you're going off of a blood test where the half-life is, maybe it could be a little better if you test the sulfonated version, but it's not always hard and fast. There are people who come back with, pregnenolone level of 30 nanograms per deciliter, and they take the supplement. They start at a low dose, 10 to 25 milligrams, and they have a bad reaction, and it's like they didn't need it, and that's fine. Again, if you're not symptomatic and there's no like TBI, some of these intolerances, right, incomplete hormone response, don't even bother with it. The test isn't going to tell you anything. There's no reason to intervene. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if you are symptomatic and you suspect it could be this based on history, and you do supplement, if your levels are low, and you have a negative response either immediately or you reassess over a few weeks and you're not markedly better, if your life doesn't feel better, sleeping better, focusing better, etc., then it's not for you. And that's why we start low and we start slow. And we assess, right? So I just wanted to make that clear in the last video in case, like, how do you know if you should go up? Like, use your judgment, use your intuition. Don't, obviously, if something's not making you feel good, get rid of it immediately. If you do supplement this on your own, again, disclaimer, please do this ideally with a clinician. But I just wanted to make some of these minor corrections and expansions. And let me know if the rest of this stuff was helpful. Like, share, subscribe. As always, I'm active in the comments. See you in the next video.